At Thanksgiving dinner, the room erupted in applause for my sister Madison, as if she had saved the family while my father lifted his glass and called her the one who carried our name with grace. My mother smiled sweetly at me and said I was only practical, never sentimental. What none of them knew was that every month I had wired $2,000 from my own paycheck to keep their house from collapsing. My name is Natalie Carter, and for over a decade, I was nothing more than a wallet they never saw. That night, I realized the crown they placed on my sister's head was paid for by me, and one day, I would make them face it. I was 32 years old, living in Seattle, and to anyone looking in from the outside, my life seemed solid. I worked at Columbia Northwest Bank, the kind of job that demanded long hours and steady focus, and I had carved out a small apartment near Lake Union that felt like my own. But whenever I thought of family, the air grew heavier. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, still lived in Portland in the old Craftsman house, with the peeling porch railings, and every call, every visit, circled back to one name: Madison, my older sister. She was the star in their sky, the perfect one. Madison was 36, a lifestyle blogger in Los Angeles who lived for curated photos and free vacations. Yet in my parents' eyes, she was a marvel. They praised her cooking, even though she rarely cooked her charm, even when it cut sharp her resilience, even when it was me wiring money each month so the mortgage got paid. I never corrected them. I worked quietly, I deposited $2,000 at the start of every month, and I told myself it was easier this way. Love, I thought, was shown in sacrifice, so I sacrificed, and they applauded Madison. The last Thanksgiving I spent in Portland was the moment I understood how deep that shadow ran. The table was heavy with turkey stuffing pies Evelyn had bought from the store and claimed as her own. Madison breezed in an hour late wearing a cream sweater dress that probably cost more than my rent. She kissed our mother's cheek, laughed at something our father said, and immediately the air shifted. Everyone leaned toward her as if she carried warmth in her pocket. I set out the last bowl of mashed potatoes unnoticed while they applauded her new blog partnership with a skincare brand. My father lifted his glass and said with pride that Madison had always known how to take care of family. I heard the words and felt something cold press against my chest. I had been the one covering their missed utility bills, the one who quietly added my credit card to their account so late fees would stop piling up. Yet in that moment, I was invisible. When I tried to join the conversation mentioning a promotion I had earned at the bank, Evelyn smiled politely, then shifted the spotlight back to Madison. It was as if I had spoken into a void. I sat through dinner forcing bites of dry turkey, listening as relatives asked Madison about Los Angeles and her glamorous life. When she laughed, it filled the room. When I spoke, no one noticed. At one point, Evelyn turned to me with a sweet but cutting smile and said, "You have always been the responsible one, Natalie. We never had to worry about you." The table nodded approvingly. My cousin chuckled, saying it must be nice being so dependable. In their eyes, I was not remarkable, I was a safety net. My sister was the treasure, I was the quiet ledger line. Later that night, I stood at the sink rinsing dishes while Madison posted selfies from the dinner table. Richard's laughter carried from the living room where he retold her high school achievements as though they had happened yesterday. My hands trembled under the stream of hot water. I told myself I should be grateful that my role was important in its own way. But the truth pressed hard. Every sacrifice I made had become invisible, absorbed into the myth of Madison's perfection. I dried my hands, stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, and for the first time admitted to myself that no amount of giving would ever be enough. I returned to Seattle and threw myself into work, hoping that numbers and ledgers could quiet the ache. At Columbia Northwest Bank, I managed corporate accounts, calculating risk assessments, and analyzing portfolios that sometimes held more zeros than I could process in one glance. It was demanding precise work, the kind that required me to stay late in a fluorescent-lit office when everyone else had gone home. Yet I found comfort in the structure. I knew that if I worked the overtime, if I kept my head down every 2 weeks, my paycheck would arrive, and I could send $2,000 straight to Portland. That transfer had become as automatic as breathing. Each month I logged into my account, set the wire, and watched the balance dip. I told myself it was duty. Mortgage payments, overdue insurance, medical bills for Dad's blood pressure medicine. Sometimes Evelyn called afterward, her voice syrupy, saying she was grateful. More often she would slip in a phrase that cut deeper than she realized. Thanks to Madison, she would say, our family still looks respectable. I would sit with the phone pressed to my ear, biting back the urge to remind her whose money had actually kept the lights on. Lucas, my boyfriend, noticed the exhaustion first. He was 36, a software engineer who worked downtown. One night he came over carrying Thai takeout and found me hunched over my laptop, reviewing quarterly reports while my own dinner went cold. He leaned against the counter and asked why I looked like I was carrying someone else's mortgage. I laughed softly but did not answer. He pressed, not unkindly, "Do they even know how much you give?" I shook my head and told him it was not worth the fight. He frowned, but he let it go. On weekends, when I finally had a day to myself, I scrolled through Madison's Instagram. There she was in Cabo sun, glinting off her oversized sunglasses, cocktail in hand. A week later, she was in Miami, tagged in a luxury boutique, smiling with a shopping bag dangling from her wrist. Her captions always read something like, "Living my best life," or "Grateful for family support." Thousands of likes, comments calling her inspirational. I would stare at the images until my vision blurred my jaw tight as I thought of the hours I spent in a cubicle so that she could pose on a yacht. Clara, my closest friend from college, who now worked as a real estate attorney, caught me scrolling one afternoon during a coffee break. She glanced at my phone, saw Madison posing with a new designer handbag, and raised her brows. "Is that what your $2,000 a month is buying?" I locked the screen, quickly embarrassed. She said gently that I should keep records receipts, something to protect myself. I promised I would, but inside I knew I would never confront them. Not yet. Every holiday it played the same way. I wired the money. Evelyn thanked Madison. My father raised his glass to the daughter who carried the family's reputation. Relatives clapped as if an award had been presented. I smiled thinly, feeling the weight of their blindness press down on me. The myth of Madison's perfection was a performance, and I was funding the stage lights. One evening, after a 12-hour day at the bank, I collapsed on the couch with my laptop still open. A notification chimed, another overdraft notice forwarded from my parents' account already linked to my card. I rubbed my temples and clicked through, ready to cover it again, when Lucas's voice echoed in my memory. "Do they even know? Did they care?" My hand hovered over the keyboard, frozen between habit and fury. I shut the laptop and sat in silence. The apartment dark, except for the city lights flickering outside my window. For the first time, I felt the seed of doubt grow into something sharper. I was not just invisible. I was being erased, rewritten out of the story I had been paying for all along. And that thought would not leave me, because the next family dinner was only weeks away, and I already knew what they would say. The evening air in Portland was heavy with the smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread when I walked up the steps of my parents' house. Strings of lights flickered on the porch as if to announce the importance of the gathering. Inside, relatives filled the living room, voices colliding in bursts of laughter and gossip. I slipped out of my coat and carried the wine I had brought to the kitchen where Evelyn was arranging platters, as if she had spent all day cooking when I knew most of it came from the store. She kissed my cheek lightly, already distracted by Madison's arrival behind me. Madison swept in, wearing a silk blouse, hair styled in loose waves, her phone clutched like a trophy. The room seemed to tilt toward her. Uncle stood to greet her. Cousins rushed over to ask about Los Angeles. My father boomed with pride as he led her to the dining room. I followed silently, placing my wine at the end of the table. We sat down, and soon the conversation shifted exactly as I expected. Richard raised his glass and began talking about how Madison had always known how to bring people together. He reminded everyone of her recent blog post about community support during the floods in California, as if words on a screen had paid off the Carter mortgage. Laughter circled the table. Evelyn added that Madison carried the spirit of family with her wherever she went. Then her eyes flicked to me, and she said that I was the practical one, always working, always counting numbers. There was a pause, then a chuckle from someone, and Evelyn smiled as if she had delivered a compliment. Heat crawled up my neck, but I forced my face still. Practical. Responsible. Not loving, not generous, not cherished. My fork scraped against the plate as I cut through the meat that had already gone dry. I wanted to say that I was the one wiring money each month, that the insurance and the lights and the roof existed because of my quiet sacrifices. But the words stuck in my throat. Madison leaned back, swirling her wine, and with a sly glance, she lifted her glass. She thanked our parents for showing her what family meant, for always trusting her to carry the family name with grace. The relatives clapped politely, some murmured how proud they were. My eyes met hers for a split second, and I saw the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She knew exactly what she was doing. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered flowers with my fingertip to steady myself. Around me, the conversation kept moving, stories about Madison's recent trip to Miami, her new sponsorships, the friends she had made in Hollywood circles. I listened as if from underwater, each word muffled yet sharp enough to cut. At one point, my cousin leaned across the table and asked why I never shared more about my job at the bank. Before I could answer, Evelyn jumped in, saying, "Natalie is too modest. She is always busy, but not very sentimental. She values work more than family time." Her voice was sweet, but it sliced deeper than any insult. The table laughed softly, as though being told I lacked feeling was a charming observation. I set down my fork and reached for my glass of water, careful not to spill as my hand trembled. My chest tightened, but this time, something inside me shifted. I no longer felt small. I felt cold. My eyes hardened as I looked at Madison, holding court at the other end of the table. She lifted her glass again, smile wide, basking in the attention that had always been hers. In that moment, I saw my place in this family with a clarity that left no room for denial. I was the ledger line, the dependable shadow, and she was the crown. Yet as I sat there in silence, a thought pulsed stronger than the ache. Crowns slip and shadows carry weight when the lights go out. The dinner ended in laughter and clinking glasses, but I walked out with a decision forming quietly, one that would not stay silent for long. Back in Seattle, I sat down at my small dining table with a stack of papers and my laptop open, determined to face the numbers I had avoided for too long. The screen glowed against the dark window, reflecting a face I barely recognized, tired and wary. I opened my online banking records, scrolling back month after month. The figures lined up neatly, $2,000, wired at the start of every cycle, as steady as the tide. I pulled out a legal pad and began to write the totals each year, adding up like bricks in a wall pressing against my chest. 2,000 became 24,000, multiplied across 10 years, until the number swelled beyond $250,000. My stomach turned as I stared at the final sum. This was not just support, this was my life siphoned away. Curiosity twisted into suspicion. I opened the shared account my parents had once asked me to help manage, the one I rarely touched because it carried their name. The statements unfolded like a confession. Payments to Lexus Financial Services, amounts far higher than any utility bill. A down payment wired to a dealership in Los Angeles. The purchase lined up with the very month Madison had flaunted her new white SUV on Instagram, writing "grateful for family support" beneath the photo. My hand went cold on the mouse. I scrolled further, each line confirming what I already feared. Spa packages, boutique clothing stores, airfare, not to Portland but to Cancun. They had not only relied on me for their mortgage, they had funneled my sacrifices into Madison's lifestyle. A rage I had never allowed myself to feel surged up so sharp it made my throat ache. I called Clara, my friend in real estate law, and read off the transactions. She listened in silence, then said firmly that I needed to start keeping every record, every transfer, every receipt. She told me I was not wrong to feel betrayed. I hung up and pressed my forehead to the cool edge of the table, trying to steady the spinning in my head. Images of the last dinner replayed. Richard calling Madison the spirit of the family, Evelyn praising her grace, Madison raising her glass with that smirk. All the while, it had been my money propping up their illusions. I was the nameless sponsor, the silent benefactor, the invisible ledger line. The next morning at work, I could barely focus on client reports. Numbers blurred together, turning into luxury receipts and loan payments in my mind. When Rachel, my coworker, noticed I was distracted, she asked if I was okay. I almost laughed at the irony. She had no idea I had just discovered a decade of my life had been stolen piece by piece. That night I printed the statements, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a folder. I stared at the weight of it in my hands, a decade bound by staples and ink. My chest tightened, but not with shame anymore. With clarity. I was done pretending I did not see. As I turned off the desk lamp, the apartment sank into darkness. But inside me something had been lit. The truth was brutal, but it was also freeing. I knew now that I had been nothing more than a wallet with no name, and knowing that meant I could finally decide what to do about it. The folder sat on the table like a loaded weapon, waiting for the moment I would finally use it. And that moment was coming sooner than they could imagine. I drove back to Portland on a Saturday morning with the folder of statements in my bag. The freeway stretched gray and endless, and with every mile my grip on the steering wheel tightened. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, the sky was overcast, pressing low as if it sensed what was about to happen. Evelyn opened the door before I knocked, smiling politely, her pearl earrings catching the light. She ushered me in, already asking if I wanted coffee. I shook my head and went straight to the dining table. Richard sat with the newspaper folded beside him, reading glasses perched on his nose. Madison was not there, which felt like a rare stroke of luck. I placed the folder on the table and slid it across the surface. My father frowned. Evelyn tilted her head, both of them confused. I told them calmly that these were the bank statements, every transfer I had made for more than a decade. I told them I had seen the payments to dealerships, the boutique charges, the airline tickets. My voice did not rise, but my chest hammered. Evelyn waved a hand as if brushing off a child's tantrum. She said I was being dramatic, that sometimes money moved around in complicated ways, that Madison deserved help now and then. I cut her off and asked directly why they had used my support for her luxuries. My father folded the paper slowly, set it aside, and looked at me with tired eyes. He said that was the role I had been born into. I was the strong one, the one who could handle responsibility. Madison, he said, was the light of the family, the one who carried their spirit. The words hit like a slap. I sat there frozen, staring at him, wondering if he even realized what he had admitted. Evelyn reached across the table, her hand cool on mine, and told me not to let bitterness eat me alive. She said sacrifice was love, and I had been blessed with the ability to sacrifice more than others. My throat burned. I pulled my hand away and told them I was done sending money, that I had given enough. Evelyn's smile faded. Richard's jaw tightened. He muttered that I was being selfish, that I was abandoning them when they needed me most. I laughed once, sharp and bitter. I reminded them I had already given more than most children would ever dream of giving. Evelyn's face hardened, and she accused me of wanting to punish Madison, of being jealous. I stood pacing the room because sitting still felt impossible. My voice cracked as I told them I was tired of being invisible, tired of being praised only for how much I could give up. Richard pushed back his chair and stood, his frame still broad even in age. He looked at me with the weight of disappointment and repeated slowly that some children were born to carry burdens and some were born to shine. His voice was steady, certain, as if he were reading a truth carved into stone. My stomach turned, and I felt the air leave my lungs. That was it. That was what they truly believed. Silence spread across the room, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I gathered the folder, tucked it back into my bag, and told them I would not discuss it further. Evelyn called after me, saying I would regret this. Richard shook his head, already lowering himself back into his chair, as if the matter was settled. I walked out into the gray afternoon with my chest hollowed out and my hands trembling, but something inside me had cracked open. The drive back to Seattle, blurred rain streaking across the windshield, my reflection faint in the glass. For the first time, the shame was not mine to carry. It belonged to them, and I could feel it slipping off me mile by mile. Yet in the quiet of the car, one thought grew louder. If I stopped, if I truly cut them off, they would have to lean on Madison. And I already knew she could never bear the weight they placed on me. When I got back to Seattle, the city lights blurred against the wet pavement, and by the time I parked outside my apartment, the decision had already settled inside me like a stone. I kicked off my shoes, hung up my coat, and went straight to my desk. The folder of statements sat there heavy with proof of every sacrifice, and I opened my laptop with hands that shook but not from doubt. I pulled up the transfer page at Columbia Northwest Bank, typed in the familiar routing numbers, and entered $2,000. My finger hovered over the confirm button longer than it ever had before. For 11 years, this ritual had been thoughtless like clockwork. Tonight, it felt like walking to the edge of a cliff. I exhaled slowly, pressed the button, and watched the numbers shift on the screen. The confirmation code blinked once, then disappeared. I printed the receipt, the thin paper sliding out of the tray with a mechanical hum. I held it in my hands and felt the finality of it. This was the last time. I reached for the scissors in my drawer, sliced the receipt clean in half, then again, until the pieces were nothing but scraps scattered across the desk. My breath came fast, almost ragged, but a weight lifted as the paper fell. I whispered to myself that it was finished. No more transfers, no more invisible giving. Lucas came in from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of tea. He saw the shredded receipt and raised his eyebrows. "Is this what I think it is?" I nodded, still gripping the scissors. His smile was small, but steady. "About time, Nat." He set the mug beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You have done more than enough. Let them stand on their own." I wanted to believe him. Yet even as relief flickered, guilt coiled in my chest. The voice of my father echoed, saying I had been born to carry the burdens, that Madison was the light. I clenched my jaw, forcing the thought away. That was their truth, not mine. I stacked the folder back on the desk, slid the drawer shut, and closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the heater. I sipped the tea Lucas made and stared out at the city. Rain tapped against the glass, steady and rhythmic, like an unseen clock counting down to whatever would come next. That night, I lay awake, turning the decision over in my mind, searching for cracks. Each time I felt the pull of doubt, I reminded myself of Madison's Lexus, her vacations, her silk blouses that my money had paid for. Each time I saw Evelyn's smile twisting into disappointment when I told them I was done. I told myself that silence was not cruelty, it was survival. The next morning, I checked my account one last time. The transfer showed cleared the balance, lower the cycle complete. I deleted the recurring payment schedule that had lived on my profile for a decade. The screen went blank where the line used to be, and for the first time I felt like my life belonged to me again. I dropped the shredded receipt into the trash, tied the bag, and carried it down the hall to the chute. The sound of the bag hitting the bottom echoed up final and hollow. I stood there a moment listening, then walked back inside. The quiet felt different now. Not empty, but expectant, like the air before a storm. I knew that soon the phone would ring, that the silence from Portland would break into demands and guilt. And I was ready, because the next time they called, my answer would not be what they expected. The call came late on a Tuesday night while I was finishing a report for work. My phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting with my father's name. I stared at it for a long second before answering. His voice was tight, stripped of the usual booming confidence. He asked if I could wire money quickly, that the mortgage was due, that things had piled up faster than expected. I kept my tone even. I told him I had already given more than enough. Silence crackled on the line. Then Evelyn's voice broke in. She must have been beside him, the sharp edge of panic in her words. She said I could not just walk away, that family responsibilities did not end because I felt tired. I let her finish, then I said the words that had been burning in me for weeks. Ask Madison. She is the one you call perfect. Let her pay it. The pause that followed was like a blade pressed against skin. No sound, no breath, just emptiness. Then Evelyn hissed that I was being cruel, that I was punishing my sister out of jealousy. My father's tone turned cold, saying I had no right to abandon them. My grip on the phone tightened. I told them clearly that I was not abandoning anyone, I was simply refusing to be used. My voice did not shake. Evelyn began to cry, accusing me of wanting to see them lose everything. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, letting her words slide off me like rain on glass. I told her I had carried the family for more than a decade, and that they had mistaken duty for love. I said I would not cover for Madison anymore. The silence returned heavier this time. I heard my father exhale sharply. Then, the line went dead. I sat there with the phone still warm in my hand, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, guilt rushed in the old reflex to patch things up, to call back, to fix. But then I pictured Madison's Lexus, the vacations, the handbags. I remembered Richard's words, saying she was the light, and I was the one born to carry weight. The guilt shrank into anger, then into something harder, steadier. Lucas came out of the bedroom, rubbing his eyes, asking if everything was okay. I told him the truth in one line. I said I told them to ask Madison. His eyes widened, then softened into relief. Good, he said, it is about time. He wrapped an arm around me, and for the first time in years, I felt supported instead of drained. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing my mother's cries echo faintly, but beneath them was something else. A strange quiet, almost peaceful. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line, and I had not moved when they pushed. The next morning at work, I felt lighter, though I knew the storm was just beginning. They would call again, and they would not accept no easily. But I also knew something had shifted forever. They had asked for help, and I had given them the only answer that could not be undone. Later that week, Aunt Margaret called. She said she had heard whispers that my parents were upset, that Madison had been pacing and ranting on the phone. Her voice carried a trace of pride when she told me she thought I had done the right thing. I thanked her quietly, gripping the phone until my knuckles ached. I hung up and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the water. The storm had started, and it was rolling straight toward Madison. She would have to face the weight she had never carried, and I knew the cracks would show. Madison's voice reached me days later through the family grapevine, sharp with panic and desperation. She had tried calling friends in Los Angeles, leaning on old favors, asking for loans. No one wanted to get pulled into her chaos. Even the brand sponsors she used to flaunt online turned their backs. By the end of the week, she was posting filtered photos of lattes, pretending everything was fine, while the walls of Portland were closing in. The notice from Columbia Northwest Bank arrived on a gray morning in February. A thick envelope stamped in red: foreclosure proceedings already in motion. I knew because Aunt Margaret called me first, her voice low, telling me Evelyn had been seen pacing the front yard, clutching the letter, while Richard sat on the porch steps, staring at the ground. Margaret said neighbors had started whispering, and the family's polished image was unraveling fast. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was Evelyn, her tone cracked, asking if I could just cover this one last payment, promising it would buy them time. I listened without speaking, staring out at the skyline from my office window. When she paused, waiting, I repeated the same words I had told them before. Ask Madison. She hung up without saying goodbye. That weekend, I drove down to Portland, not because they asked, but because I needed to see it for myself. The house that had once been a symbol of our family pride looked different now. The porch railing sagged, the blinds in the front window hung crooked, and a yellow notice from the bank was taped to the door. Across the street, a neighbor pretended to trim hedges while glancing over with pity. Madison's Lexus was parked in the driveway, spotless and gleaming against the backdrop of decay. I stood at the edge of the yard, my hands buried in my coat pockets, watching Evelyn peek through the curtain before quickly pulling back. She did not come outside. Richard opened the door instead. His face was drawn, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, I saw him without that air of authority, stripped down to a man who no longer had control. He called my name softly, but I did not move closer. He asked if I would reconsider, if I would help them just until things settled. His words sounded hollow even to him. I told him the truth in a voice colder than the February air. I had carried them long enough. It was time for Madison to prove she was the perfect one they had always claimed. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Richard's mouth opened as if to respond, then closed again. He nodded once, turned back inside, and shut the door. I stayed there for a while, looking at the faded paint, the steps where we once posed for family photos, the windows that had glowed every Christmas. The house was no longer ours, not really. It belonged to the bank now, and soon it would belong to strangers. A chapter was closing, and they were powerless to stop it. As I walked back to my car, the sound of my boots on the pavement felt final. For the first time, I did not feel guilt or shame. I felt clarity. Justice did not always come in flames or shouting matches. Sometimes it came in silence, in the simple refusal to keep carrying those who never carried you. Driving away, I let the words form in my mind, steady and sharp. Sometimes justice does not need to scream. Sometimes it only needs you to tell them to stand on their own with the crown they worshipped. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the one expected to carry everything while another was praised for nothing? Do you believe justice in family comes from sacrifice or from finally stepping back? Share your story, your truth, because voices like ours deserve to be heard.